One afternoon, deep in the apocryphal history of China, Empress Lezu was preparing tea in her garden when she noticed the cocoons of silkworms on a nearby mulberry tree. She took some cocoons back to her tea table, accidentally dropping one into her cup. Upon removing it, she discovered a strand of thread dangling from the cocoon. She pulled, and the strand continued to grow. Lezu had discovered silk. Gifted a grove of mulberry trees by her husband, the Yellow Emperor, Lezu developed sericulture, the science of silk production, which for centuries would be among China's most valuable state secrets. The Chinese scrupulously guarded the origins of silk for more than 2 millennia after its discovery, until it spread to India sometime around 150 BC as the inevitable result of the thriving trade between the two countries. Another 600 years passed before the mystery of sericulture finally reached Europe, whose people had believed for many centuries that silk was simply harvested whole cloth from certain trees native to China. Silk processing remains the same now as it was thousands of years ago. The cocoons are placed in hot water to kill the larvae and loosen the filaments, which are combined to form yarn, wound, and dried. A single cocoon may yield 1,000 yards of silk. Durable, soft, dirt-resistant, easily dyed, the perfect fabric. This nearly invisible thread, woven into a textile exuding sensuous luxury, predates the discovery of perspective drawing, but would centuries later come to undergird visionary technologies of human disembodiment. Digital images originated with cartographer Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD. The system of coordinate pairs contained in the alphanumeric commentary of his maps allowed them to be visually reconstructed without distortion from strings of letters and numbers. However, it was Joseph-Marie Jacquard, a silk weaver in Lyon, France, around the time of the Revolution, whose invention of the punched card for use in his automatic looms presaged today's vision technologies. Jacquard took the digital image, then obscure, and gave it over to mass production in the medium of silk using punched cards. These cards would become the physical basis of computation for the next century and a half, repurposed to this end by Charles Babbage, who kept in his foyer a mechanically woven silk portrait of Jacquard, which most of his visitors mistook for an engraving. Babbage is often mislabeled the inventor of the computer based on his unrealized plans for the analytic engine. Yet its predecessor, the difference engine, the world's first automatic mechanical calculator, could not have existed without Joseph Clement, a London blacksmith and draftsman who began his profession by building a lathe on which he made the wind instruments he taught himself how to play. Clement's devotion to his work carried him to the edge of the possible. He worked for years with some of the pioneers of mechanical engineering. This seemed to make him an ideal partner for Babbage, who needed in the manufacture of his wheelwork levels of constancy and precision rarely seen outside contemporary Switzerland. The collaboration between the two was close, and given the complexity of the machine, it is impossible to say with any certainty how much of its implementation should be attributed to whom. The first piece of the first difference engine, what Clement called the beautiful fragment, was delivered to Babbage in 1822. Clement and Babbage were from separate social classes, and neither could ignore what would become the reason why the difference engine could not be completed. Clement allowed all the workers of his shop to keep whatever tools they made in the course of fulfilling a client's order. Babbage found this unacceptable. He wanted the new tools used to create the difference engine moved to his own estate, where he planned to pay individuals trained only on specific machines wages far lower than those of Clement's artisans. Their relationship quickly collapsed, leaving Clement to fade into historical obscurity and Babbage to eventually die alone, widely known in his time as a crank with a penchant for shouting down street musicians. In the 4th century, around the time Europe was introduced to silk, China was introduced to a nascent Buddhism, the teachings of the Yogacara as delivered by Parmatha, which in turn prompted Xuanzang's legendary Journey to the West in Search of the Law. But China did not receive these teachings directly from India. Instrumental to this transmission were the Indo-Greek cultures of Central Asia, whose states would later be destroyed in conflicts featuring weapons which could be both crafted and wielded with efficiency by very small groups of people. Though the instruments of war had changed considerably on the eve of the 20th century, the general condition of war was still one of amateur weapons. This is not a time of inaccessible antiquity, but just beyond the threshold of living memory. A world where deadly force was so egalitarian, so comprehensible, so bound to human will and action. The emergence of modern specialist weaponry during World War I was accompanied by the first images of cyborgs. The cyborg never consists simply of a mind and body, but of all technologies by which we externalize aspects of our sensing, thinking, and communicating. The cyborg emerged from the Dada of Weimar Berlin, where technologically mediated perception had turned inward to reveal a humanity which was inextricably bound to its physical technologies of mediation. Sensory perception and interior perception are transformed by repeated interpretations of the ancient idea that who we are is not something bound by organic limits, that the self is not contained by a body, but extends into the world and is distributed throughout it, an idea capable of countering and reinforcing the mutual tendency of science and religion to move the place of all power to a transcendental, supersensory realm. George Grosz, one of the founders of the Berlin School of Dada, sometime before fleeing to America, wrote, "War freed many an individual from the environment he hated and the slavery of his everyday routine. This is one of the psychological causes and enigmas of war, and that is why there is and always will be war." In the summer of 1918, the head of Princeton's math department was put in charge of the U.S. Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground, a weapons training and testing facility on the shore of Chesapeake Bay, the same style of military brain trust as Los Alamos a generation later. There, every available American mathematician was being enlisted to compute the artillery firing range tables of the escalating European war's many new kinds of weapons. Among them was Norbert Wiener, a young mathematician and natural scientist who had graduated from Tufts and Harvard before joining the world's first war mobilization of mathematicians and physicists. Wiener's wartime engineering career would last from the First World War and into the Second, when in 1940, MIT President Vannevar Bush met with President Roosevelt at the White House, emerging with a mandate to form and direct the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, charged with initiating and coordinating scientific military research. Bush's first initiative was to organize a network of 700 universities and research institutions, whose resources he would apply to war-related scientific and technical projects. He sent personal letters soliciting suggestions for the best use of scientists in the coming war. At the same time, the military became itself a primary source of funding for scientific research, through the newly established Office of Naval Research and similar counterparts elsewhere in the military. Later, after the new National Science Foundation was chartered by Congress, America's government would for the first time pay more money to large corporations to conduct scientific research than to scientists at universities and research institutes. Such arrangements weren't the only idea, of course, but when the first intimations of what would eventually become the NSF emerged from congressional proposals as an agency charged with overseeing and potentially overriding patents in the public interest, Bush responded by engineering an invitation for President Roosevelt to propose his own suggestions. First, that the public should have no rights to the patents emerging from the new cooperation of government and industry, and further, that the public should have no role in deciding government research priorities. Within weeks, as word of the NDRC's new projects went out discreetly through the ranks of scientists Bush had arrayed, Wiener found his second wartime calling: to develop fully automated range-finding systems for anti-aircraft artillery. While the principles of feedback and electronic control had been discovered at Bell Labs in the 1920s, and automated firing controls existed from the late 1930s in the form of expensive and arcane electromechanical kerosene predictors, Wiener's work on this project in the fields of stochastic processes and controls would prove revolutionary. German bombers during World War II flew at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, at altitudes as high as 30,000 feet. Unlike World War I, when artillery could be aimed in simple parabola at slow-moving targets, the flight time of an artillery shell to this height could be as long as 20 seconds, and firing that shot accurately, at a point in space nearly 2 miles downrange from where the plane had been targeted, required a crew of up to 14 men to spot the plane through binoculars and keep it in view, then to relay its changing positions to human computers, who performed hasty manual computations of the plane's projected location and passed those coordinates to the gunners, who, in turn, rotated their heavy turrets into position using hand cranks and, finally, fired a volley of shells toward the target. Far more complex than the computation of mundane artillery range tables, Wiener now had to create a complete system with which to predict the future position of a fast-moving plane based on its past and present positions, then to calculate range, take aim, and fire with split-second timing and precision. An electronic anti-aircraft system that would, in his words, usurp a specifically human function. On February 1st, 1942, he dispatched his first formal report to the NDRC. Going far beyond a specialization in anti-aircraft weaponry, Wiener redefined the whole concept of control in new scientific terms for the electronic age. The significance of this report to America's post-war technology boom is difficult to overstate, and in the years through the war, the number of American industrial research laboratories mushroomed from about 1,500 to more than 10,000. In his report, Wiener made it clear that the electric domain of wired signals, radio waves, and radar beams was where control of every form of modern technology would reside forever after. He defined the elementary unit of communication, the message, in the broadest technical terms as an array of measurable quantities distributed in time, transmitted by electrical, mechanical, or nervous means. This was the advent of cybernetics. In the 19th century, French physicist André-Marie Ampère, a founder of the science of electricity, used the word cybernetique to describe what he called the art of government. But Wiener would not learn this until some time later, having taken the word from the Greek kybernetes, or steersman. Wiener revolutionized the concept of feedback, making the distinction between biological and physical systems and the different forms of information that could be found in each realm of nature, proving that the principle of feedback was mathematically equivalent to the physiological process of homeostasis. To survive and adapt to the world around them, all communication systems, natural and constructed, need a balance of negative and positive feedback. Receiving and using information is part of the process of adjusting to the circumstances of an environment required for any system to function within that environment. In the span of only 2 years, Wiener conceived of, defined, and quietly announced the coming of the newly unified interdisciplinary science of control, the fruits of which were increasingly picked in consolidated research laboratories. American science turned a corner during this war, taking the entire world with it. As Wiener grew vocal in his condemnation of the new national science leviathan, his relationships with many of his contemporaries came under severe strain. On the 6th of August, 1945, the term Ground Zero, first spoken at Alamogordo, New Mexico, piqued the ears of a world witnessing Hiroshima consumed by nuclear fire. Nagasaki was destroyed 3 days later. Of the nearly 250,000 killed, 120,000 died instantly. As described by Secretary of War Henry Stimson,
the atomic bomb was more than a weapon of terrible destruction, it was a psychological weapon.
The murder of hundreds of thousands of civilians was instrumental in breaking the resolve of the Japanese, whose moral prohibition against surrender was an unacceptable obstacle to an American military which demanded that victory be unambiguous and total. The morning of August 7th, Wiener furiously declared that the decision to use the new bomb on civilians signified the beginning of a new and terrifying world with which we should have to live ever after, in which, for the first time in history, it has become possible for a limited group of a few thousand people to threaten the absolute destruction of millions without any immediate risk to themselves. The early post-war years saw a record number of strikes by organized labor, and for many industrialists, the new age of the automatic factory, of machines without men, could not come fast enough. Corporate anti-labor sentiment was shared by many politicians and most of the military, particularly the Air Force, which led the long campaign to bring automation to the aircraft industry and the new domain of the manufacture of guided missiles. Wiener wrote, "The automatic factory and the assembly line without human agents makes the metaphorical dominance of the machines a most immediate and non-metaphorical problem. It gives the human race a new and most effective collection of mechanical slaves to perform its labor. Such mechanical labor has most of the economic properties of slave labor. However, any labor that accepts the conditions of competition with slave labor accepts the conditions of slave labor and is essentially slave labor. The answer, of course, is to have a society based on human values other than buying or selling. This thing will come like an earthquake. The impact of the thinking machine will be a shock certainly of comparable order to that of the atomic bomb. The machine is not frightening because of any danger that it may achieve autonomous control over humanity. Its real danger is the quite different one that such machines, though helpless by themselves, may be used by a human being or a block of human beings to increase their control over the rest of the human race, by means not of machines themselves, but through techniques as narrow and indifferent to human possibility as if they had, in fact, been conceived mechanically." Wiener's cybernetics were revolutionary, but still more so may have been his thoughts on the economic value of information. He wrote that the nature of information as a commodity differs radically from that of matter or energy, and so applying traditional market values to the realm of information and communication can only do harm as long as the mechanisms of the market itself do not operate on the basis of human values. He did not intend his criticism of applying a market approach to information as an indictment of any social or economic theory, but as a recognition of a new economic reality unique to the nature of information itself, and concluded that the application of the laws of market commodities to information would lead inevitably to its misunderstanding and maltreatment. No scientist in the post-war era stood in sharper ideological contrast to Wiener than John von Neumann, an early and ardent supporter of the military-industrial complex. When the Cold War commenced, von Neumann enlisted as a consultant to dozens of government and industrial organizations, and advocated a preventive atomic attack after the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan. Abhorring all forms of social activism, he developed a mathematical theory of games for achieving desired outcomes among competitors in economic transactions, which would become the centerpiece of America's new arsenal. The new atomic military regime of the Cold War required not the numerical computations of the first generation of institutional computers, but elaborate game-like simulations, which provided a means of thinking the unthinkable, of lending mathematical realities to the speculations of generals, businessmen, and politicians. Von Neumann's work was elaborated upon by John Nash and the Rand Corporation as the nuclear balance of terror strategy of mutually assured destruction. And when the American Management Association later sought to translate war games into business games, it hired members of Rand's logistics department as consultants and designers. In 1958, the year the first integrated circuits were produced at Texas Instruments, the Naval War College closed down its tiled wargaming room, descended from the old Prussian Kriegspiel, and replaced it with the computerized Navy electronic warfare system. News allowed war games to be played using a computer mainframe to track the movements and calculate the results of a combat. This affinity between games and computers existed long before electronic vision became commonplace. Konrad Zuse, a German scientist working in isolation from the developments in Britain and America, completed a chess program in 1942, 5 years before Alan Turing. Zuse introduced to science the idea of computational space, the idea that the entire universe is the result of ceaseless computation, and he believed cellular automata to be the foundation of everything which can be experienced as material reality. What would he have thought of Mandelbrot's remark that fractals didn't exist until after the computer? The same year news emerged, so did Tennis for Two, the precursor to Pong, exhibited on an oscilloscope at Brookhaven National Laboratory. In 1962, at the same MIT lab where Norbert Wiener had walked the halls only a few years prior, Spacewar was developed, the first program still recognizable as a video game in the contemporary sense of the word. Miniaturization of computer components to meet the demand of the war industry continued at a rapid pace throughout the 1960s and 70s, but the widespread introduction of integrated circuits into consumer technology occurred after September 1975, when MOS Technologies' 6502 microprocessor debuted at Westcon for less than a sixth the price of comparable processors, $25. People thought the price was a misprint. Zilog introduced its Z80 the next year, and shortly thereafter, microcontrollers began appearing in every type of electric device, simultaneously heralding the eras of personal computers and personal electronics. From these developments came the arcade machine. Space Invaders introduced the high score list in 1978, the same year the John Birch Society stopped propagandizing Soviet baby eating. This development led to the creation of social arcade spaces. As the video game left the research laboratory, so did the 20-minute matches of Spacewar leave the video game. The environments within games were now determined by the physical environs which contained them, and it was an ongoing series of brief, decisive matches which guaranteed high revenues. The object was not to reach any particular state, but simply to keep the game going. In one way or another, these early games without stories can all be seen as variations on the Sisyphus motif, tending toward the interminable. Still, what makes video games and their evolving interfaces so enjoyable is their power to simulate the tiny freedoms inexpressible in the built environment. The simple pleasure of agency, of manipulation, of being a cause, of moving an object or letting gravity move it for you, of splashing water or scattering seeds in the wind, of participating freely in the systemic principles which govern the world. As arcades across America began closing in the first half of the 1980s after the rise in home video games, a newly ascendant Nintendo of America paid millions of dollars in patent royalties on video technology to Sanders Associates, later a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin.
I asked my daddy what this Star Wars stuff is all about. He said that right now we can't protect ourselves from nuclear weapons. And that's why the president wants to build the Peace Shield. It would stop missiles in outer space so they couldn't hit our house. Then nobody could win a war. And if nobody could win a war, there's no reason to start one. My daddy's smart.
Save the Peace Shield. 1010 Vermont, Washington.
The golden age of the home video game was not only the time of Reagan's first strike nuclear options, but also of newly deregulated banking and massive debt escalation cleverly disguised as stock market populism. Financial plays were a strong theme in early video games. Inside Trader, Wall Street Kid, Black Monday, all virtualized the real investment practices that would themselves be thoroughly gamed in the decades to come. Situated somewhere between voting and gambling is the practice of investing. For all the ability of electronic networks to democratize information, access to real-time market information is carefully managed. The rules of the game are rewritten so quickly and with such uncertain consequences that it is only an extremely small group who benefit from having rules at all. How can the global actions of money possibly be regulated in the interests of a people, or a society, or a future? It is part of the ideology of modern markets that they can occur at any place and time, and that the individuals involved need not be known to each other. With these assumptions taken to their extreme, markets would, over the course of the 20th century, come to take on the properties of their models until the two became indistinguishable. Though the market had long been a network functioning independent of place, the exploitation of this abstraction from geography and social relations brought financial markets to a realm of pure mathematics vastly more conducive to the models of economists. To speak of virtual trading in the early 21st century is to speak simultaneously of the imaginary properties of game worlds and the techniques of global financial capitalism. In the summer of 2010, the independent programming firm Nanex showed the rapid, steady oscillation of stock prices and futures markets generated by computers automatically making thousands of trades every second. The exact purpose of these particular pieces of high-frequency trading software are unknown. They likely originate from the large firms who introduced noise into the system, which they themselves can easily filter out to test latency times, determine price trends, and confuse competitors. To ask if such markets can be made more equitable, more democratic, is strictly taboo. This would require reclaiming the form of money from the institutions which currently define it, creating a money which is not systematically scarce and beyond all but the most centralized control, but an honest means of accounting for the exchanges of goods and labor. When people can again establish meaningful connections between their work and the business of humanity, then the world can be transformed, and we can finally begin to solve the problems left to us by the high age of money. In an age of networks, money can at last take the fluid form of people seeking to measure the consequences of their actions. To return money to being something which communities can control would mean its reintroduction to the principle of self-correction, of feedback. Sentiments of the democratizing power of computer technology had long been found on university campuses, and it was in the 1980s that these notions became more widely relevant as microcontrollers and microprocessors were increasingly embedded in every kind of device, few more novel at the time than those connected to the screen. But the means of controlling the culture of the screen itself, which had long seemed to be approaching quickly, remained fixed on the horizon. Corporate targets of creating new markets for consumer hardware were met handsomely, but independent distribution channels remained elusive. When the Supreme Court ruled out the possibility of a ban on tape-based video recording devices in 1984, the Motion Picture Association of America led a campaign to tax videotape, with an example of the kind of ideological carpet bombing that Americans now tend to accept as normal. An industry letter appearing above Charlton Heston's signature and mailed to various congressional districts warned that
a group of wealthy, powerful Japanese electronics firms has invaded the country, threatening one of America's most unique and creative industries.
It was implied that as the hardware of home piracy came out of Japan, so too did its historical role, which threatened the ultimate bastion of global American supremacy, the business of culture. So did anti-Japanese sentiment become instrumental in the transformation of the VCR owner from a potential producer of culture to a criminal producer of cheap copies. In this narrative, every act of piracy furthered Japan's domination over the United States, and in newspaper cartoons, ferocious samurai, who feared no death, battled Hollywood producers on the home front. One wonders if the record industry would have been more successful at conveying the dangers of audio tape had they published leering caricatures of Germanic burghers. Remarks like Heston's played on widespread anxieties about economic and technical decline. In the wake of the oil crisis, facing massive and growing trade deficits, the country convinced itself that it was about to be eclipsed and that Japan would supplant it. American news media fueled fears that the contest for supremacy with Japan was already as good as lost, that America was doomed to one day become an economic colony of Tokyo. Such screeds mattered because they professed to explain Tokyo's inevitable victory in terms of culture, with the favorite explanatory device being keiretsu. Laissez-faire was obsolete, went the corporate argument, set to be replaced worldwide by a social model embracing the characteristics of keiretsu, of cartels and trusts and vertical integration. Sony's Betamax was quickly overtaken by VHS, which, though technically inferior, had no restrictions placed on what kind of content the medium would be allowed to carry. Reflecting on its failure, Sony came to a decision which took into account the rift between technology and what is called by the electronics and culture industries content. In the emerging information age, the divide between industrial and creative properties could prove vastly lucrative to any company capable of bridging it. And it was on this reasoning that Sony undertook in 1987 what was among the largest of Japanese media acquisitions at $2 billion, CBS Records. 2 years later, Sony moved to buy Columbia Pictures for several $billion, again seeking to connect the intellectual properties of technology and creativity at the corporate level. The deal came at a moment of uncertainty for the United States. With a reconfiguration of global politics underway, anxieties about Japan found a focus in Sony's bid for Columbia. What came to represent this American fear of Japan was a book, the original published in Japan earlier in the year to swift sales of 500,000 copies, but with which Americans would become familiar through extensive piracy. The book was entitled The Japan That Can Say No, by Sony chairman Akio Morita and novelist cum politician Shintaro Ishihara. Morita's contribution was a critique of American capitalism that was, if not welcome, at least familiar. Ishihara's was intensely controversial. Japan, he posited, could afford to flex its political muscle because the United States' nuclear capabilities had become entirely dependent on Japanese technology. Were Tokyo to withhold this technology, or offer it to another player, it could portend a radical shift in global power. Word of all of this arrived in Washington as the fate of the Sony bid for Columbia Pictures had to be decided, and photocopies of an anonymous translation began to appear on Capitol Hill. The entire text was inserted into the congressional record, from which thousands of copies were distributed. The Japan That Can Say No was requisitioned in the name of exposing a secret truth. In this case, the hidden national strategy behind Sony's appropriation of an American cultural industry, crystallizing the American fears undergirding Japanophobia. Suddenly aware of how damaging the book might become, Morita swiftly withdrew from a planned English translation, thus ensuring that the only version to circulate in English was the bootleg, the source of which was revealed to be the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. The Pentagon said that the book had been intended for internal use. Nevertheless, Ishihara demanded that his government file charges against the United States for piracy. In the end, it mattered little, because America's supposed fear of Japan was summarily erased the next year, as Bush I announced that the U.S. would be waging war on Iraq. It would be, as the television programs of the time said, a new kind of war. When it was over, President Bush would remark,
"My God, we kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all."
At the center of this Vietnam syndrome were the notions that thorough and truthful media coverage undermines public support for war, and that different foreign policy objectives are more sensitive to exposure in different types of media.
Do you think the censorship is necessary or excessive?
You mean their censorship or our censorship?
Oh.
We don't have any, of course.
It was during the Gulf War that images such as these would be seen for the first time. Popularly referred to at the time as the Nintendo War, the early 90s video bomb slaughter in Iraq made visible how closely linked the informatic revolutions of play and war had always been. On September 11, 2001, this symbiosis was taken to a new level. So complete was the transposition of life world and game world that on the morning of September 11th, America's entire defense apparatus was completely flummoxed by it. As reports poured in of a hijacking, the fighter planes positioned for strategic interception of hijacked aircraft remained grounded as the same question crossed the airwaves over and over. Is this real? Or is this just part of the game? Never before had war been waged with the screen itself. Like the single shot of the JFK assassination before it, showing everything and proving nothing, the plethora of videos of New York City that morning provide the fertile ground for all kinds of hypotheses, some even more unlikely than those proffered by the government. But before the campaign of shock and awe could be waged against the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, it would first need to be waged on Americans. To successfully sell a war based largely on the lies of an Iraqi man the CIA called Curveball, false intelligence alleging weapons of mass destruction, some of it obtained through torture, had to be artfully manipulated to short-circuit a vast bureaucracy ostensibly designed to prevent such manipulation. Private contractors made this easier by further eroding an already fallible system of public oversight. And so did the long war come to be fought by a $100 billion industry with a vested interest in its continuation. An elaborate feedback loop between models of vision and opinion from which no citizen was exempted. The Pentagon even proposed an office of domestic perception management. Opponents of the idea called it propaganda. The Pentagon called it public relations. How often is the difference between the two ever clarified? The military spoke of what it called full-spectrum dominance exercised over TV-watching Americans, offered exactly two shades of opinion: the high-gloss computer-generated red, white, and blue of the studios, or the sunless green of the war zone. It was a brilliant sleight of sign. The enemies of tolerance were no longer bigots and warmongers, but weaponized Muslims to be defeated in a virtuous war against absolute evil. Agents of hate, the government officials would call them, always something like that. This appropriation of tolerance after 9/11 became a part of the US government's necessarily shifting justifications for war, part of the tale of a clash of civilizations, in which tolerant neoliberal capitalism must wage global war to defend the world against intolerable intolerance. The more recent invasion of Iraq began on March 19, 2003. Saddam Hussein's army was defeated in 3 weeks, but there were soon signs that something had gone awry, that the plan, reportedly successful, was not working as expected. Lieutenant General William Wallace said a week into the conflict, "The enemy we're fighting is a bit different from the one we wargamed against." The first US combat fatality was a Marine shot at point-blank range by men driving a civilian pickup truck. The first suicide car bombing of a US checkpoint occurred 10 days after the occupation began. The next month, when asked what he meant when he said the game is over, Iraq's UN ambassador Mohammed al-Douri replied, "The war." And while Bush's cabinet stage-managed what they called the coalition of the willing, a new kind of internationalization was underway, one which would aid in making such outmoded concepts as sovereignty and self-determination fully obsolete. If it is an aim of humanity to construct society, rather than just take it as it comes, then all 20th century experiments with popular rule have been failures, concentrating solely on expanding political rights amid crippling and restrictive economic conditions. Ironically, after the entire 20th century was spent warring over which form of the state would predominate, states themselves were rendered ever less significant by their own ruthless assaults on history and locality. The world over, the dominant mode of social organization everywhere takes the form of centrally organized workers, producing what are called surpluses. And the dominant feature of this world is sustained violence of unprecedented scale. Of the more than 170 security companies operating inside Iraq, the most infamous was Blackwater, one of an emerging array of new corporate entities capable of overthrowing national governments. Loudly and conspicuously branding themselves all-American freedom lovers was necessary to conceal the reality of the mercenaries the company deployed to Iraq from countries such as Nicaragua, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Honduras, and Chile. When the forms of public force are themselves private, do citizens still enjoy security by right of their membership in a state? The Buddhist canon of Digha Nikaya predates the writings of John Locke by 1,000 years, but is similarly concerned with the consent of the governed as the basis of political legitimacy. Should the king betray his kingdom by disregarding the teachings, then it is a sign from heaven that his subjects are justified in disregarding his rule. The writings of John Locke first emerged from London, but were reprinted in Dublin, Glasgow, Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, Geneva, Brussels, Paris, Leipzig, Uppsala, Jena, Mannheim, Milan, Naples, Stockholm, and finally Boston. When Italian readers encountered Locke, they were less likely to be viewing Locke's own words than those words as translated into Italian from a French edition produced in the Netherlands. All this is not even to enter the world of the radical Enlightenment, of anonymous tracts circulated in manuscript or in editions with false imprints, the world of John Toland, of Spinozism, of the Illuminati. Knowledge in the time of Locke spread through chain reactions of reappropriation, unauthorized and denounced. New realities emerge only from new accounts of the past or the present, and prior to the invention of vision machines, it was war which was most capable of quickly reconfiguring the symbolic connections between people and events. It is only possible to exercise power through the manufacture of truth, and the last battle of any war is that in which one belligerent becomes capable of deploying his own version of history backward in time, the history of the victor, which justifies the whole of the war according to his own terms. Power is always lost on the battlefield, but the victor cannot assume it there. To do so, he must weave a story in which he, as the victor, is universally righteous, and in doing so properly reconfigure existing power networks to serve himself. The narratives of the screen, which now proliferate across the globe, are not representative of culture, at least not initially. Nor are they representative of power structures, at least not exactly. They are the fantasies of whomever wields their power, the power to create a mass meaning and, in doing so, to reduce public issues to private concerns held in silence. The fantasies, actualized on the screen, construct their own reality as they penetrate consciousness. And once a story reaches a certain degree of cultural ubiquity, questioning or tampering with it becomes antisocial behavior, regardless of how little reality is at stake. We are not expected to think, for example, of the war in Iraq as being a nuclear war, despite the soaring rate of birth defects that have resulted from the dumping of more than 400,000 pounds of depleted uranium into the cradle of civilization. Denser than lead, and cheaper as well, given to weapons manufacturers for free to use in the penetrating rods at the center of munitions, since to send it away with arms merchants costs less money than disposing of it in a way that causes no harm. This, while the specter of dirty suitcase bombs is periodically brought out for display. Perhaps the ghosts of Nagasaki and Hiroshima are still restless, those first victims of global terror who helped to produce for the first time in America's history a uniform national psyche, one of mass nuclear fear. How to hold on to such a powerful means of governmentality after half a century, after the end of the threat of nuclear war? If September 11th had not occurred, it would have been necessary to invent it. America's leaders, Macbeth-like, cower at the phantoms of the past, which are always replaced by ones ever greater and more terrifying. In Japan, there is a word for the shaping of a small garden to make it appear larger. Miegakure, or hide and reveal. Miniature gardens, snow globes, fish tanks, bonsai. The art of the miniature requires a state of safe completion, where nothing is missing and nothing can be taken away. Fish tanks are not boxes of water, they are ponds or streams or oceans, just as bonsai are forests and not farms or highway easements. Clear boundaries and a consistent level of abstraction make the miniature world believable by making it wholly perceptible. Poets once sought to understand the eyes of God, but who imagines a bird's eye view anymore? These tiny, self-contained worlds exist by establishing the very criteria they are designed to meet through their projection of the mental map of the observer onto a smaller physical space. 1,000 years ago, Buddhism was often the easiest religion for states to adopt because it situated the figure of the king as the medium through which worldly power was expressed. The three estates of clergy, nobility, and commoners were related to a social whole solely through the king, in whose person the nation was embodied, on whose body the realm was inscribed. In an absolute monarchy, there is no useful discussion of political questions, since there is no public apart from the person of the king. He alone is capable of making decisions affecting the entire realm. the bridge between the worlds of seen and unseen. The king is the advocate of his people before heaven and the sacrificial hostage of heaven to his people. And so the decision to initiate violence on a societal level was always restricted to kings, and history abounds with the records of their wars. Emperor Ashoka massacred thousands during his conquest of South Asia, but following his conversion to Buddhism enjoyed a stable and peaceful reign. While states may have adopted ideologies of non-violence in Buddhism, these ideologies were never applied to the violence perpetrated by the state itself. Buddhist texts on civic responsibility, for all their discussion of how the king rules, say nothing of how he may come to rule. Buddhist scholars had long recognized that they had little influence in matters of war and territorial acquisition, and that the best course of action for their doctrine was therefore to elucidate the boundaries of war, to ritualize it and thereby confine its horrors, allowing the doctrine to stand uncompromisingly by pacifist values, while not alienating the war-making classes on whom it depended for protection. Yet war is only a cultural function so long as it is waged within a sphere where participants regard each other as equals, or at least antagonists with equal rights, a space, like the ball court or the court of law, ritually separated from ordinary life. When groups are magically stripped of their humanity by calling them heathens or heretics or barbarians or communists or terrorists, there can be no war, only mass murder. In the Buddhist code of war, non-combatants must be kept from harm, as must any combatants who flee or fall, who are disarmed or surrender, or who are, as the writings state, petrified with fear. Further forbidden is the confiscation of harvests or destruction of buildings, reservoirs, orchards, and all things well developed and constructed. Buddha denied that those who died in battle achieved nirvana automatically. Instead, through their disobeyal of war's sacred precepts, warriors were far more likely than most to be reborn in hell. This was all part of a program of compassionate violence, a sphere of war which, by being completely delineated and divinely enforced, prevented any society which came in contact with wars waged by Buddhists from being made to suffer marauders and warlordism. Violence is forbidden in Buddhism for a number of reasons. Among them, the notion that violence harms those who practice it by fostering in them states of mind that they should be seeking to overcome. There are other canonical views. The Treatise on Absolute Contemplation states that people may be killed when the killer becomes capable of perceiving his victim as empty and dreamlike, an absolute other, nothing more than a phantom, the shadow of a human being grateful for the release from the world of the flesh. A life without security, certainty, or predictability. A life fixed to nothing, adrift in an environment which it is never allowed to shape. A life subject to being shattered at a day's notice. These are the lives which seem so often to emerge in space-time where executives speak of new markets being opened, and it is for this reason that peace is enforced somewhere and denied elsewhere. Peace now only has worth when it is a peace that allows money to move as it pleases. Money which stands still is no longer money. All its worth comes from computer-generated anticipation of its movements in the future. And really, what is to be made of the new forms of war which twice arrived from America at the site of the colonial great game of the 1800s? Mythic narratives, easy victories, never any bodies in our streets. Academic writing on games often alludes to what is called a magic circle, the crucible of the ritual of the game proposed by Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, who wrote of games as an autotelic activity, engaged in for their own sake, psychically segregated from everyday life. Such accounts set games well apart from global economic and military turmoil, and yet Huizinga himself, writing in the shadows of the approaching fascism which took his life, was acutely aware of an inescapable relation between the magic circle and worldly power, stemming, perhaps, from game's position as among the first human, even mammalian, means of ordering attention, a biologically innate feedback loop. That the mind sometimes experiences unpleasant disorder when not engaged in goal-driven action began in the distant past as a valuable safety feature. boredom directs us to new challenges and anxiety to new skills. And in order to avoid these feelings, a person is forced to incorporate more of the world and thereby grow in complexity. Games, whatever form they may take, have in their origins a kind of deep-seated ritual function whereby the boundaries of the world itself are tested.
They're murderous. They're working on all these people, right and left, but those are my views. I mean, but most of all, the thing that I want clearly understood, and I know that state does not agree with this. State is against Brazil, and they're against Brazil, the Dominican Republic, for the wrong reasons. They're against them because they think they're both dictatorships. I like them because they are. Not because they're dictatorships, but because they're friends of the United States. That has got to be made clear to these people. Friends of the United States are rewarded, enemies of the United States are punished. And that includes Peru, to the extent we can. It includes Bolivia, to the extent we can. And it includes, by all means, Chile, to the extent we can. That's the way the game has to be played. And as far as the African countries are concerned, they don't have to.
In the early 1960s, the CIA became increasingly involved in the politics of Chile. Project Camelot, begun in 1963, was initially sponsored by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, but soon shifted to CIA control with assistance from the RAND Corporation. Researchers were sent to Chile and other Latin American countries with questionnaires that polled attitudes on politics, the responses being fed into a computer system called Politica, which simulated crisis situations for use by the Military Police Training School at Fort Gordon, Georgia, and was also used for the creation of propaganda distributed by the CIA, despite that agency's public statements that the U.S. had no vital national interests at stake in Chile. But propaganda operations were among the formative experiences of the still young CIA, which, shortly after the death of George Orwell in 1950, dispatched agents to meet the author's wife Sonia to ask her to sign away the film rights to Animal Farm. She did this in exchange for a meeting with Clark Gable. The screenplay was scrutinized by the Psychological Strategy Board, who reworked parts of the text they found problematic, most notably the ending, where Orwell wrote, "The creature outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which." Viewers of the CIA-financed cartoon, however, got something very different, a story which ends with the mere sight of the pigs impelling the animals to mount a successful counter-revolution by storming the farmhouse. By removing the human farmers from the table, the CIA effectively neutralized Orwell's conflation of communist and capitalist oligarchies. A strange prefiguration, this cartoon, of the CIA's actions in Chile, in which the military overthrow of a democratically elected president was held out by the U.S. government as the best thing for the Chilean public. Henry Kissinger went so far as to say that Americans could not respect the irresponsibility of the citizens who had elected Salvador Allende. Dr. Allende had in 1933 co-founded Chile's Socialist Party. He was in charge of the campaign of the Popular Front movement in 1938. Their slogan, bread, a roof, and work. He had run for president unsuccessfully in 1952, 1958, and 1964. The nationalization of heavy industries, particularly copper, was supported by most Chileans, and Allende's plans built on efforts by the previous Chilean president, Eduardo Frei Montalva, to accelerate and make more profound the efforts to lessen social inequality by increasing industrialization and agrarian reform. Despite the millions of dollars given to his opposition by American corporate and intelligence institutions, Allende was elected president of Chile in September 1970. Against the wishes of the United States, he hoped to create what he called the Chilean way to socialism. His relationship with Moscow was congenial but tense. He had condemned the Soviet invasions of Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, and made it clear that he had no intention of running either a Soviet-style bureaucracy or a client state like Cuba. The success of Allende's Popular Unity Coalition vaunted Chile onto the world's political stage, where it was variously hoped or feared that Chile would successfully pioneer a third way between the two ideological poles of the world's superpowers. On the day of Allende's election, U.S. Ambassador Edward Corey sent no fewer than 18 cables from Santiago to Washington. Kissinger said that Nixon was beside himself. On the morning of September 15, 1970, 11 days after the election, Nixon met with Kissinger, Attorney General John Mitchell, Pepsi Cola Chairman Don Kendall, and Augustin Edwards, owner of a Pepsi bottling plant and the right-wing newspaper and radio station El Mercurio, who told his American hosts that Allende's election was the first step toward the establishment of a Soviet client state. Following this meeting, Nixon met with CIA Director Richard Helms and instructed the agency to prevent Allende from taking power by instigating a coup. Helms left the meeting with a budget of $10 million and instructions to make the Chilean economy scream, something accomplished through the cooperation of U.S. companies, such as those whose representatives met with Secretary of State William Rogers later in the month, to form a covert economic blockade in cooperation with, among others, Ford, Citibank, Bank of America, and ITT. Helms's instructions evolved into Project Fubelt, in which Chilean Army General René Schneider was murdered, but which failed to provoke a coup or block Allende's confirmation. Edwards' El Mercurio would go on to be the recipient of almost half of the CIA's expenditures in Chile. In September of 1970, ITT Senior Vice President E.J. Garrity met with the Clandestine Services Division of the CIA to develop a plan to collapse Chile's economy by encouraging companies to artificially delay transfers of money and goods to Chile, and to convince companies with foreign technical experts to withdraw them. The Nixon administration further outlined its new Chilean foreign policy in a national security memorandum. The United States would cut off $70 million a year in Alliance for Progress money, oppose any and all international loans or private investment, and look for ways to disrupt the world copper market, to which Chile was a major supplier. The CIA gave nearly $2 million to opposition parties in 1971 and 72, financed anti-Allende media, and bankrolled labor strikes against the government, while the Chilean embassy in Washington, D.C., and the residences of Chilean diplomatic officials in New York were broken into by the same team of White House plumbers responsible for the Watergate burglaries. Instrumental to Chile's economic transition and ending foreign control of its natural resources would be theories and models of cybernetic control created by Norbert Wiener in the U.S. and expanded upon in England by Stafford Beer. By 1956, at age 30, Beer was Director of Operational Research and Cybernetics at United Steel, the largest steel corporation in Europe. Beer met Norbert Wiener in 1960 during his first trip to the U.S. At this first meeting, Wiener dubbed him the father of management cybernetics, not believing that cybernetics was a useful tool for the study of social systems because they could not generate the consistent, long-term data sets needed for accurate statistical prediction. In 1961, Beer left United Steel to co-direct Sigma, a French-owned consulting company that applied the new interdisciplinary science of cybernetics to business problems. Beer's aspiration was to use cybernetics to change industry and government in the same way that the military had been changed during World War II, through mathematical modeling and simulation. After 5 years, he left Sigma to work at International Publishing Corporation. In 1970, Beer left IPC to become an independent consultant, and was doing so when he was contacted from Chile by a young student named Fernando Flores. Flores was studying industrial engineering at Catholic University in Santiago when he became familiar with Beer's work at Sigma and devoted himself to mastering cybernetic principles, becoming the acting dean of the Department of Engineering Science at Catholic University at age 27. Flores was active in Chile's academic and political circles, and in 1969 was part of the movement of Popular Unitary Action, a party of young intellectuals critical to Allende's narrow electoral victory. The Allende government appointed him General Technical Manager of Corfo, the state development agency that Allende had charged with nationalizing Chilean industry. It was the third highest position within Corfo, and the position most directly linked to the daily management of the factories. In July of 1971, Beer received a letter from Flores stating that he was familiar with Beer's work and was now in a position from which it is possible to implement on a national scale, at which cybernetic thinking becomes a necessity, scientific views on management and organization. He asked for Beer's advice on applying cybernetic principles to the management of nationalized industries, and Beer replied enthusiastically, "I simply must ask you whether I could play some part, although I do not know what to suggest. Believe me, I would surrender any of my retainer contracts I have now for the chance to be working on this. That is because I believe your country is really going to do it." The next month, Flores flew to London to meet Beer at the Athenaeum. Flores spoke little English and Beer no Spanish, so they communicated in a mixture of French, English, and Latin. Flores informed Beer that he had assembled a small team and asked him to travel to Chile and direct their efforts applying cybernetic principles to a wholly new system of economic management. Like Allende's popular unity government, Beer was searching for a way to make structural changes to existing institutions quickly, but in a way that did not threaten their democratic foundations. Beer worked frantically with Flores' hand-picked team to develop plans for the new system capable of regulating Chile's economic transition, writing, "In Chile, I know that I am making the maximum effort toward the devolution of power. The government made their revolution about it. I find it good cybernetics. But the tools of science are not anywhere regarded as the people's tools, and people everywhere become alienated from that very science which is their own." Accompanied only by his translator, Beer walked to Allende's presidential palace at La Moneda, while the rest of his team waited anxiously across the street at the bar at the Hotel Carrera. Face to face with Allende, Beer began to explain his work, at the heart of which stood the viable system model, a 5-tier structure based on the human nervous system, which Beer showed Allende to exist in all stable organizations, biological, mechanical, and social. Allende, trained as a pathologist, immediately grasped the biological inspiration behind Beer's cybernetic model and knowingly nodded throughout the explanation. It was not the response Beer had expected. He later wrote, "I explained the whole damn plan and the whole viable system model in one single sitting, and I've never worked with anybody at the high level who understood a thing I was saying." Beer acknowledged the difficulties of achieving real-time economic control, but emphasized that a system based on a firm understanding of sound cybernetic principles could accomplish technical feats deemed impossible in the developed world, even with Chile's limited technological resources. By the end of the conversation, Beer had secured Allende's blessing to continue the project. Beer used a telex machine in the London office of Chile's state copper company to maintain contact with the team in Santiago. Allende's program of nationalization, however, was not without its problems. State appointments of management to industry seemed no less inclined to hold expertise above patronage than their corporate equivalents, and though the government could not create a new regulatory agency, nor reform the existing one from the ground up, it could eliminate the need to do so by establishing new and more direct channels of communication between the state and the sites of production. This was the origin of Project Cybersyn. Stafford Beer arrived in Chile on November 4, 1971, the first anniversary of the Allende administration. Arriving 6 days later was Fidel Castro, marking the end of Cuba's political isolation. "Most people couldn't wait to see Castro," Flores would say, "and I couldn't wait to see Stafford Beer. It was kind of a joke." Beer wrote, "We are working on feedback systems to link the people to their government. The polarity between centralization and decentralization, one masquerading as oppression and the other as freedom, is a myth. Even if the homeostatic balance point turns out not to be always computable, it surely exists. The poles are two absurdities for any viable system, as our own bodies will tell us. And yet, government and business continue the great debate, to the advantage only of those politicians and consultants who find the system in one state and promptly recommend a switch to the other. People wonder whether to centralize or to decentralize the economy. They are answered by dogmas. People ask whether planning is inimical to freedom. They are answered with doctrines. People demand an end to bureaucracy and muddle, and they are answered with a so-called expertise, which from its record has no effect. While the previous Christian democratic government had encouraged U.S. investment, high import duties atop already high prices made computer technology a less attractive option to Chilean industries than to North America's. At the time of Cybersyn's inception, 3 U.S. companies, NCR, Burroughs, and IBM, had fewer than 50 computers installed in Chile, including a small number of mainframes. The National Enterprise for Computers and Informatics, a centralized government agency established in the 1960s to oversee the purchase of computing technology, tried to maintain its monopoly by frequently denying requests from universities and private firms who wished to acquire computers, and would allot time on only one machine to Cybersyn. Gustavo Soto, an army major who worked for Flores at Corfo, gave the Cybersyn project its first break. 400 telex machines in storage, purchased as a surplus from the U.S. by the Frey government, but never installed. Networked together, these machines, humble in even their own time, would provide input for a simple Bayesian statistical control system, Cyberstride, written by Chilean engineers in consultation with engineers from British consulting firm Arthur Andersen. While the elements of national economic models and simulations were hardly advanced for their time, or even wholly functional, Cybersyn was designed, very much like the Internet of today, to rely less on intensive computation than on high-speed mass information exchange. Chile, with only 50 computers, was undertaking efforts towards real-time communication still in their infancy in the United States, and which had, due to their conflicts with state and party hierarchies, been abandoned in Russia almost a decade ago. In spring of 1972, the first telexes from the newly nationalized industrial sectors of textiles, agro-industry, forestry, and construction were transmitted to the National Computer Corporation, and the first version of the National Economic Simulator had been produced. A simulator which would allow Corfo to acquire new and dynamic understandings of systems with as many as 100 variables, compared to the unaided brain's limit of 5 to 9. This software was not intended to be an all-encompassing and precise model of every facet of a national economy, a predictive black box, but a medium by which one could, in playing with the simulator, expand one's intuitive understanding of complex economic systems. Using only the discarded teleprinters installed at the centers of production across Chile, data such as total output, flow of raw materials, and rates of absenteeism were gathered on farms and factories and wired to the operations room in Santiago, where changes in the allocation of resources and personnel were made accordingly. Beer wrote, "Since Chile's natural resources will one day make it a rich country when those resources are properly deployed, it follows that the stranglehold on credit is not a solely economic matter. It appears to me that the government did not anticipate the full vindictiveness with which the rich world would react to its actions, which I emphasize have, so far, been perfectly legal. We must learn how to expunge technocracy without rejecting science, because the proper use of science is really the world's brightest hope for stable government." Beer's last meeting with Allende was on July 26, 1973. After his return to England, he wrote to Allende on August 2nd. Beer's letter was never answered. In August, a second truckers' strike came. When it began, only 10% of trucks were in operation, a figure which rose to 30% by the strike's end. And yet the government, newly empowered by its telex network, managed to keep supplies of food, fuel, and raw materials flowing. By mid-August, the alliance of the CIA and right-wing military forces had murdered 20 truckers, bombed 2 fuel pipelines, and destroyed several power transfer substations. On September 3rd, Quepasa warned of Cybersyn as a terrible weapon of control that would lead to the complete domination of Chilean private life. Whether or not the experiment was a success is impossible to say. It was never completed. On September 11th, 1973, Allende's government was overthrown in a military coup headed by General Augusto Pinochet. 4 months after the coup, the military created the Department of National Intelligence, DINA, which served as Pinochet's secret police, using information gleaned from torture and surveillance to detain and disappear the real or imagined enemies of the new government. Eventually, more than 3,000 Chileans were disappeared and more than 100,000 tortured. CIA operations in Chile were terminated in June of 1974, and that December, General Pinochet was declared supreme leader of Chile. The next year, under the auspices of DINA, Operation Condor was announced, an international operation extending into 9 different countries, where paramilitary forces with the oversight and assistance of the CIA would murder community organizers, trade union members, and public school teachers, resulting in at least 60,000 deaths. In the decades that followed, the global banking and heavy industrial firms which operated in Chile would go on to collect billions of dollars in revenue from Pinochet's military dictatorship. And yet, for however violently it ceased, or whatever its precursory problems, the Cybersyn ops room lingers in the imagination. Could the power to create a more just society ever come from such a place? Will similar efforts in the future aimed at resisting Western financial hegemony be met with a similar degree of violence? Or, when it happens again, will it be more severe? All modes of expression must conform to some analyzable system. Without such a system, there is no way to interpret a medium of communication. Computers are popularly thought of as being mathematical machines, but they function just as easily as, say, linguistic machines. Their power lies in the ability to manipulate symbols, translating from one language to another, making strategic decisions in simplified military operations, making logical deductions, orchestrating a melody. But has it become easier for us to imagine living among better appliances than among better human beings? When will we upgrade to a society which is more humane? Or will the world's most refined pattern manipulator, in its application to patterns of human behavior, ensure that the people of the world become progressively less and less able to resist the plans others make for them, plans of money, war, and ecological exhaustion? Public discussion of the worth of the natural world, public discussions of the worth of a life, these have long been fading and may long continue to. Slowly, those who rule become more comfortable in thinking of the sum total of human consciousness as that element which is added to the machine so that its simulations may be addressed as reality. The digital screen gives all abstract information a concrete expressive platform, a binding. It is a meta-medium capable of expressing any abstraction. What such technology puts at stake is the capacity to intervene on the existing forms and narratives that mediate between the individual and society. If it is important that we learn to see the world through the eyes of others, then the computer offers powerful new tools with which we may attempt this, tools which pretend no promises of universal good. Control of the material means and methods of abstraction is one of the roots of the present copyright regime of the United States, one which betrays its own ferocity with an ever more surprising frequency, sending students to jail for modifying the video game consoles they purchase, using dozens of paramilitaries to apprehend copyright infringers with no criminal records, having the Department of Homeland Security issue press releases from Disney real estate, and condemning as terrorists those who fix the eye of the viewer behind the wrong gun. Humans are programmed to treat culture as the storage medium for collective memory and experience, and it follows that the economic control of culture is a very serious business indeed. It seems now, given such abundant capacity for simulation, that it should be possible for anyone to use a computer, not just to access any variety of simulations past, but to actively construct new simulations using the collective sum of human knowledge which exists within the computer and its networks, to create and recreate a spectrum of real-world phenomena to the end of solving humanity's many shared problems. There are technical barriers to this, but they are soon overcome. The true obstacle lies in the collections of experts, with the power to systematically withhold vast collections of knowledge from the public. This impulse towards concealment of information takes many forms: professionalism, or propriety, or copyright, or national security. The more we modify our world, the more we must modify ourselves to exist within it. But from whence will these patterns of modification come? The brain not only reads the surrounding world, but also bestows meaning on it, and this meaning originates in memory. Traditional human mediation is not by data, but stories, though a great transformation has taken place over the last 50 years, accelerating each decade, as the stories of families and communities cease to be a part of everyday social life. Social protocol is now formulated in boardrooms before competing for the consumption power of the young, as the locus of human sociability moves from body to screen. Beginning at the same moment as history, humans have always striven toward a materialized memory, and it is easy to make too much of this phenomenon, to get lost in nasty ciphers beyond individual comprehension, where the principal concern ought to be who is promoting which technologies and why. Every technology is capable of producing its own social arrangements, should we allow it. One need look no further for evidence of this than the growing portion of humanity which levels mountains and poisons rivers to trace dark veins into the earth for the raw materials responsible for fabricating the machines which convince so many of the arrival of a new golden age, free from all the usual old oppressions. And yet never have the daily struggles of humanity been as dubious as today, when the bigotries of faster and easier slowly create a landscape where millions of lifetimes are expended producing, buying, using, servicing, and contemplating consumer objects, some of which now appear as a kind of magic mirror or universal window, part of an invisible network of the visual, binding human agency for transmission, as the world in which we live is degraded by those whose position allows them to afford to find it incomprehensible that anything need ever change. Perhaps we will one day contribute more to the existence of our networks of symbols than they contribute to ours. Perhaps we have for a long time.